futuro, si hay uno, es femenino. That was Dr. Sally Miller Gearhart's message, but not the language that she used to communicate it. And when we look at a message, it's important to comprehend not just the message itself, but the rhetorical strategies that were used to make it. In every social movement, there are rhetorics, people who strategically communicate a message to the masses through delivering triumphant speeches, putting slogans to picket signs, or calling allies into action. Language strategies and tactics are a powerful tool that are employed to achieve a rhetoric's goals. Sally Miller Gearhart utilizes the language strategies of identification and polarization in one speech, one book chapter, and one documentary interview to command the attention of the religious right, to create a collective we among lesbians and heterosexual women through feminism, to demonstrate the role that lesbians play in the women's movement, and to call for political action. In this presentation, I will give a biography of Sally Miller Gearhart's life, review language strategies and tactics, discuss the historical context, rhetorical challenge, and responses to each artifact, along with providing excerpts to demonstrate the rhetoric and engage in a group discussion and analysis, and close with the implications and impacts of this analysis on the LGBTQ+ movement. So who was Sally Miller Gearhart? She was born in Parisburg, a tiny rural town in Virginia, on April 15th of 1931. And she was brought up by Appalachian, quote, salt of the earth people, believing in the threefold God and the everlasting virtues of hard work, a clean house, and a strong drink. Coming straight from Sally's autobiography itself. After her parents' separation, she was raised primarily by her maternal grandmother at a women-only boarding house. And from there, she was shown from a young age that women are, quote, source of power, the heart of action, and the focal point of love. This foundation of woman loving continued as Gearhart went on to attend Sweetbriar College, a woman-only institution, where she studied English and drama. She went on to obtain an MA in theater from public address at Bowling Green State University in 1953, and then obtained a PhD at the University of Illinois in 1956, also in theater. Her life continued to be centered around academia and education when she began teaching after her PhD. She accepted a professorship role first at Stephen F. Austin State University in Texas, and then transferred to Texas Lutheran College. And she was a professor in Texas for over a decade, but she spent that entire point in her life deeply closeted. And this subjected her to a lot of potential blackmail and other situations that were really just not her living as herself. And that was until she moved to San Francisco in 1969, and her entire life changed. She accepted a position at San Francisco State University and became the first openly gay professor to receive tenure track at a major university. And 1978 is regarded as probably the biggest year in the public eye for Gearhart. That year she published Wanderground, Stories of the Hill Women, which is still today one of the most notable pieces of lesbian science fiction, and we'll hear more about that from Gearhart in a second. That same year she also worked with Harvey Milk, if we remember from our history lesson, and she defeated Proposition 6 alongside Milk. Gearhart's writing also had an expansive scholarly discography, and one of the most notable was The Womanization of Rhetoric that came out in 1979. Essentially, this piece was her discussing the fact that rhetoric, or in and of itself, is an act of violence, which is very ironic considering what we are studying and presenting on today. But this comes out later in her life anyways, so we can say that this comes out after all of her artifacts. But instead, she offers this idea of a women-based communication style as an antidote to the violence of using rhetoric. Finally, Gearhart helped establish something called Women's Land in Willitas, California, which was basically her real-life Wonderground. It was a group of primarily lesbian women living in the forest, living off the land, and loving each other. And so she eventually moved there full-time with her land partner. That's Jane Gurko, pictured there on Women's Land in the center. And that's where she would die at 90 years old in 2021, leaving no living survivors except for her breathing theories, stories, speeches, and essays that carved the way for women in scholarship, lesbians in the church, and feminists in the forest. Since most of us probably don't know who Gearhart really is, just my synopsis is kind of brief. I'd like to kind of show what Gearhart was like. And to do that, I have a documentary trailer that I would like to show that was being created when she died by Deborah Craig. I'm not sure if this link will work, but I'm prepared for technical difficulties, so we'll try this first. That's what I expected. One moment. Brief transition.
I'm sorry. I just caught our camera woman and she's smiling. It's fun having her behind the camera. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, she's so...
I'm supposed to give a brief warning that there is some choice language and some brief nudity in this documentary trailer, so if you'd like to avert your eyes,
On her
be my
knees.
guest.
God, I haven't had a woman on her knees for me for a long time.
This is Sally Gearhart.
And would you like for me to hold the camera for you? She is a force of nature.
Here come the lesbians, here come the leaping lesbians. There are those people apparently who question the health and the beauty and the naturalness and the strength of same-sex relationships. And all I've got to say is I wish they were here today.
She reminded me of Maya Angelou, you know, the way she would just wrap you into her words.
The woman just exuded charisma. Everything about her was as glamorous as a radical lesbian could be. You know,
She just had it. And we all fell in love with her.
It was such an exciting time, the 70s and this feminist burst. There was the big word patriarchy,
It was before women's studies really had started anywhere.
and it was this powerful woman, Sally, who gave women great powers in her writing and in her thinking.
She also really wanted women-only space. A lot of us did.
Women's land. And so I came to California with the dream of having land like that.
Are you a lesbian separatist?
Radical, lesbian, feminist, separatist, italicized.
Yeah.
In a classic case of life imitating art, Sally co-founded a women's land community at the same time she was writing a futuristic sci-fi novel that became a cult hit called The Wonderground.
Had a friend come from the East Coast searching for Sally Gearhart of the Wonderland. So the book is a fantasy about women with all kinds of psychic power living on the land and flying and teleportation, the whole works.
Sally was way ahead of her time in connecting the dots. She's a visionary.
She helped change history. I think she was seen by a lot of people as a major spokesperson for the gay community.
Overwhelmingly, it is true that it's the heterosexual men, I might add, who are the child
I think that's a myth. I've never seen.
senators, the FBI, the National Council on Family Relations, the Santa Clara County Child Sexual Abuse Treatment Center, and on and on and on.
Sally Gearhart, at a particular moment in our history, when it really mattered, she stepped up and she inspired tens of thousands of people, articulated the dreams of millions. She's an extraordinary woman.
By now I found myself wondering, why haven't I ever heard about Sally Gearhart?
Here we go, girls.
My attempt to find out
into each other's hands. We are encouraging relationships among women.
Turned out to be a pretty wild ride.
Sorry about that. You're gonna be okay. Deborah Craig, she was handed a puzzle, and it was up to her to untangle it.
So that, as I transition back, was the documentary, like I said, trailer that was being made. Hopefully will still be released. We don't actually know that for sure, but there are articles that it is still in the works. I'm sure it's a bit awkward for Deborah Craig to continue it now. But now that we have a pretty heaping idea of who it was that we are looking at, I'd like to do a refresher on what what rhetorical strategies I was looking for in her work. I'm sure you guys were super awake and took great notes the day that we reviewed language strategies, but I'd also like to highlight the specific tactics that I found in her writing. So as a reminder, language strategies are patterns or methods of language usage that attempt to achieve a specific purpose, goal, or objective. We get this information straight from Stewart himself, who we looked up previously when we read the chapter, while a tactic is a more narrow and specific use of language that help to accomplish a particular strategy. So you can kind of see the hierarchy there. So using identification, a communicator can transcend the differences between them and their audience, and by definitely identifying with them. One tactic to achieve this would be through content adaptation, meaning the use of ideas or examples that listeners or readers easily understand. Similar to this is the idea of moral symbols and revered documents, and reflecting the ideas that are found in them rather than disparaging them. And we'll look at specific examples. Another strategy for achieving identification would be for a writer to link themselves to another movement that is already present, which would help to legitimize their movement further. Another strategy that I found was polarization, which is a strategy that we have to look at because perfect identification would require no further communication, Stewart says. And the idea that unification ultimately does create separation. And so one tactic used to achieve this would be through labeling, which means creating a symbolic reality to define a specific action or event or movement or person as inherently positive or negative. And this controls the general perception or understanding of that object. And this also elicits supporters or stigmatizes those that do not support. And this looks similar to, in theory, to the second tactic, which is to force a commitment, which would be polarizing those that actively support a cause from those that do not. And by definition, this tactic leaves no middle ground. So again, now that we understand who we're looking at and what we're looking for, I'd like to get into the 3 artifacts that I studied for this analysis. For note, I'm actually presenting these in reverse chronological order, which is a bit awkward in providing the historical context, but I do this because I think it gives the best examples to clearly lay out the same way that Gearhart lays out her message in almost every single one of her pieces of communication. It follows a specific order, and so by doing it in this order, we can see that very clearly. So to begin, we have the interview that she took in for the documentary Word Is Out, Some Stories of Some of Our Lives. And to remind you of the sort of context in 1978, we remember our old friend Anita Bryant. And so we know that she was a prominent figure who perpetuated misinformation and condemned the gay community. She coined the slogan Save Our Children and established the first formal anti-gay organization in 1977. We also know that her hateful messages actually had an inverse effect on the gay rights movement than she had intended. We began to see gay activist organizations mobilizing with new membership, attendance at marches, and financial support. So our first piece, comes during that time period. The documentary first aired at Castro Theater in San Francisco in November of 1977, followed by a limited national release and some PBS televised versions in 1978. Brody Richard from the New Yorker helps us understand just how significant this piece was to the gay rights movement and in kind of the world history in general. The film interviewed over 200 gay men and lesbian women, and then features 26 of those interviews in the film. And it is the first feature film about gay people by gay people. From the production company to the directors to everyone involved, this was an incredibly gay film, and something that did not really exist at that time. And so because of the historical context and the content of the interviews themselves, this film is both a piece of political action and also just a representation of common experiences of gay people in the 1970s, as well as presenting some of their hopes and dreams for the future as they sort of look ahead. When we look at a response to the film, though, we kind of look at Harvey Milk, and so we know that he was elected as the first openly gay politician as city supervisor in California, but later in the year we saw John Briggs campaigning Proposition 6, and then eventually Milk and Moscone's assassination towards the end of the year, so we know that this was a time period of political unrest. In her interview specifically for Word Is Out, Gearhart discusses her lived experiences and ideas in the most informal and casual manner given the context in comparison to the other two artifacts. Though she addresses the exact same issues as she does in all of her communication, even though it is more casual. She discusses the idea of church oppression and marriage inequality, the power of feminism to unite lesbians with heterosexual women, and her theories on the practicality of lesbian separatism. So I'd like to show you some clips from the documentary itself, and I will awkwardly transition once again, but the reason I am doing that, also those videos began to play as I started the last one, so you're gonna see me scroll a bit, but I'm emphasizing that despite the fact that it's awkward, it's worth it, because I'm paying $11 a month for the Criterion channel to be able to show you this documentary, which just speaks to the fact of how inaccessible gay history is, because this movie is not easily accessible. There's a book version of some transcripts that I was able to find to study the actual language aside from these clips, but it's worth it to show you. It also gives you another demonstration, since this is the only communication that I have that actually shows her speaking, while the other pieces are more written, so you won't actually get to see her demonstrating the speech. So this is important, you get to hear her speak.
Into enormous pressures. I wasn't happy. I had impulse of death, for Christ's sake.
You begin to think, maybe, certainly the church is telling you that you're sinful and a blasphemer and all of that. Some of those things that Jesus was saying, were really relevant to me, and that I felt were really just right on. All of the business about love is incredibly important. But what the church did with that message, or has done with that message, has been so oppressive to women and to gay people that I can't tell you, the kinds of things that I used to go through, like going to a wedding, which would of course be a heterosexual wedding. I would never ever be validated in that way, to have a wedding in a church, to have the church validate my concern or care or love or relationship to another woman. And you sit there in this pew and you hear either the groom singing to the bride or the bride singing to the groom, or saying to each other the words from the book of Ruth, entreat me not to leave thee or to depart from following after thee, the whole business about thy people shall be my people. And it's a really beautiful thing for two people to be saying those words to each other. It would just flash on me, just all over me. Those words were originally spoken by a woman to a woman, Ruth to Naomi. And then I would flash on all of the incredible relationships out of the Bible, like David and Jonathan. There were some real love relationships clearly going on, but the church has never seen fit to validate those relationships. So you had two children.
Just the goodness of God memories.
There.
I think I shall never forget walking into the first meeting of what we were then calling Gay Women's Liberation, and there were something like 80 lesbian women sitting around in that room. I had never seen 80 lesbians together before in my life. I think it was real different being a lesbian in the 40s and
like to give the opportunity if anyone feels super compelled to make comments on their reaction to those 2 clips from the interview. If not, there will be more direct options later. Beautiful. Okay. So the second piece that we will get into, just for the sake of time, comes from her book chapter in The Miracle of Lesbianism. This goes back in time a few years. We find the movement in a bit of a lull, if you will. So this is before that period where Anita Bryant steps in. Some things were happening though. States were passing anti-discrimination ordinances that outlawed discrimination against based on sexual preference. In 1974, the same year this publishes, Kathy Kozachenko was elected as a public official in Ann Arbor, Michigan, becoming the first open lesbian to hold a government position. But generally, despite the period being characterized by an increase in awareness, there was a decline in funding and attention and attendance. So we see this piece come out during that time period, which in and of itself presents a challenge. This is a time period where most people's attention is not faced onto the gay rights movement. The book itself was co-authored between Gearhart and William Johnson, who was the first openly gay person to be ordained as a minister in mainline Protestant denomination. And the book contains 5 essays written by 4 contributors, the other 2 being Donald Kuhn and Robert Treese, which, if you can't tell by the names I'm listing, presents a separate challenge for Gearhart as someone who has already been identified as a separatist. If by theory, she's someone that feels that living with men is challenge for women to be free, to live, to thrive. This is something that's going to present a challenge conceptually for Gearhart. It is really beautiful though that through this process, William Johnson and Gearhart come to love and revere each other. They even wrote letters to one another at the end of the process that's published in the preface of the book, where they just talk about appreciating getting to work with each other, where you can kind of see her overcome that challenge. When we look at a follow-up or a response to this artifact, it's not as direct as we would see in like a speech because we don't have a direct audience, but we do know that the resurgence of the movement was due to the fury of the religious right. And maybe it wasn't just this specific text in particular, but this book specifically targets the church in its entirety. If we can't tell by the name, gay liberation and the church. And so I like to believe that documents like this, specifically targeting the oppression from the church before there was a form of anti-gay movement, had a lot to do with sparking that controversy, which would later revamp the movement entirely. And so when we look at what Gearhart was saying, we see similar issues, but we definitely see her speaking in a much more scholarly, academic, professional tone in the book. Her chapter itself is called The Miracle of Lesbianism. And she separates her argument into 3 parts. The first being lesbian/women/feminism, second being the Christian tradition's hatred of lesbians/women, and finally, lesbian/women/feminism in the church. She concludes in the chapter that reform for the church is not possible, for the structural and theological flaws of the Christian tradition is not salvageable. And that the masculinist practices that are within the church must be demolished and replaced with feminist ones. And so to give an example of what this sort of looks like, I have some quotes from the chapter that I would like to read, followed by some discussion questions that I'm hoping will elicit to have you guys sort of thinking about those 4 specific tactics that I had mentioned earlier. Each quote I'll provide as we go along the presentation will be hoping to have you think about one of those tactics. And if you were really hoping to speak about the Word Is Out interview, we kind of echo back to a sentiment that she brought up earlier. She says, "You brace yourself to go to weddings, and frequently when you get there, you hear that passage from the book of Ruth drifting from the lectern or choir loft, 'Entreat me not to leave thee.' You remember how these words were originally spoken between 2 women, and it is bitterly ironic to you that they are used to sanctify heterosexual unions, while you could never say them in a service like this to the person you love. How does she use content adaptation to catch the attention of the opposition? How do you think this affected the religious rights perspective of Gearhart?"
she's really kind of using their own words, I don't know, if not against them, but in a way.
Yeah.
Just that the comparison that those words that they're using for heterosexual weddings, and just mirrors the fact that they were actually set between two women, and it is not, I guess, a heterosexual thing in actuality.
I think it's a part of like, a lot of times I think the religious right forgets that the Bible is like systematically used against people in all types of minorities and like has been used to justify terrible things. And so when people who are within those minority groups are able to use the word accurately to describe like what's going on, it seems like they're just like in shock because like, I didn't know that you knew what the Bible was, and like, oh, I don't think like, I didn't know you could read the Bible, because they have this idea of how gay people view religion, and they assume that it's anti-religion. And I think having an overlap where you can be gay and also understand religion as well, I think that's something that shocks them, because they have their own perception of what the gay community looked like, and it completely probably changed that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of those are fantastic. I concluded very similar things. I essentially said that she's showing her respect as well as her deep understanding of the same texts that have been used to demonize her. So she clearly has read and understands the Bible just as deeply as someone that is using that text to hurt her. So she's adapting that same content that, like you said, has been used against her. She also establishes her credibility to discuss and assess the church's needs. So at the end, she's going to make big conclusions, and we'll see her make those conclusions. She at first has to establish the fact that she is credible to speak to the needs of the church. And then I finally also said that she appeals to our emotions. Though later in life, Gearhart sort of denounces the idea of marriage as a patriarchal institution, something that she wouldn't participate in. At this point in her life, we can see in multiple instances that it comes back to her that this is something that she would not be able to participate in. And this is a practice that is sacred to the Christian tradition. And so if they understand the importance and the value of it in their lives, her appealing to them as it's something that she could never experience is something that's definitely going to make a tug at the opposition that is fighting against her. The next quote I have from Miracle of Lesbianism is, "Both of us, lesbian and heterosexual, heard the shade of disappointment in the doctor's voice when he said, 'It's a girl.' We were together consumed with our concern for appearance. With our heterosexual sisters, we absorbed the subtle messages that women enjoy being raped, that we are naturally suited to housework. How does she create a collective we to unite lesbians with heterosexual women in the women's movement?"
These are, I see it as like she's bridging the gap. Like, you face these problems, we also face these problems, because we are all women. Like, we all are women. We all have this issue. This is an us problem, not just a me problem or just a you problem anymore.
That was sort of the most straightforward. But I think that it's really important to show how she does it. We know from the context as well that this is coming out in a period where feminists were actively denouncing lesbians as part of their movement. We learned all about Lavender Scare, about the Lavender Menace protest, and all of these situations where heterosexual women were putting down lesbians from their movement. And so I feel like what she's doing here is very clearly showing that your fight is my fight is yours. In her own writing, she calls this process, that what she's describing here, she does it many different ways, but she calls it sex role socialization, which all persons are subjected to, but women are victims of, regardless of sexual experiences. And I think it's just really important. She talks about it from young boys being socialized based on their sex identification, but how women are victims of this system. So we'll transition to our final piece, our final artifact, and we have finally the actual speech, is "Lesbian and God the Father, or all the church needs is a good lay on its side." So this speech comes out in February of 1972, and she delivers this at a pastor's conference at the Pacific School of Religion at Berkeley. And Cherry Kittredge from Q Spirit, who actually knew Gearhart personally, explains that Gearhart, as well as being a professor at San Francisco State, At this time, she was also co-chairing the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, a group that was educating religious and political leaders on the issues of LGBTQ, which was what placed her at the conference that day, which is what gave her sort of a podium. And when we look at challenges and responses, this one is clearly much more direct because it was at a pastor's conference. And so when we think of her challenge, we think of her audience. Clearly, the people sitting in that room did not want to hear from her. They were going to question her credibility, which we've already established that she's capable of speaking. And they were not going to be uber receptive to what she had to say simply because of who she was. So in and of itself, she had challenges. Thankfully, though, we have some fun responses as well. So originally, before she had delivered the speech, a magazine called Trends was supposed to publish a transcript of it. And it was so radical in nature that they actually rescinded their decision and refused to publish her speech. But it was also really great. And so Queer Religion has hailed her speech as the first explicit treatment of lesbians in the Christian tradition. In the speech, her message making is very similar, but again, we think about audience and context, so it's not the most academic and it's not the most casual. It's definitely a one where we think about her with an uproaring audience, if we like to think of it that way. In the speech, she discusses the subordination of women within church hierarchy. She also discusses misconceptions of lesbianism and what it means to be woman identified in a patriarchal world. And her main argument, again, is that the church's institutional flaws are not capable of reform, but a complete destruction is required. Let's take a closer look. So she says, to be a lesbian is to be identified not by men or by a society made by men, but by me, by a woman. And the more I am identified by/for me, by/for my own experience, by/for my own values, the more a full woman I feel I become. Woman-identified women who are being reborn every day are those who are shaking off the chains forged by thousands of years of ecclesiastical propaganda. How does she use labeling to create a sense of identity for lesbians in the women's movement? Do you feel it's effective? This one's probably the most difficult, but worth it.
I kind of see she's trying to say like only I can really identify who I am and put like a label on myself. And it's just a much more meaningful experience to be able to identify myself as a lesbian or having women identify themselves instead of a man coming and identifying her. So I think that's
Anybody else? I think that's great. No.
That's okay, I'm sorry.
Essentially, in this section of the speech, what I feel she's doing is she's setting apart the two groups that she just unified for you. So she just took lesbians and heterosexual women and placed them together and showed you why they deserve to be fighting next to each other, and then she goes and she breaks that down into separate labels. She says that to be woman identified and to be a lesbian are one and the same, and that anyone should take no offense to being called a lesbian, as it's the highest degree of woman loving or living the feminist lifestyle. That in of itself is powerful message making, but I think that probably what is the most long lasting in that room, and also from this quote here, is that she's demonstrating that lesbianism is more than just a sex-based identity. We see it from the title of the speech itself, but also from the misconceptions of the time period that lesbianism, from feminists themselves and from the church, is just this idea of having a sex-based identity. And what she's doing is she's showing you that it's more than that. It's a lifestyle, it's a frame of reference, it's a political choice, and it's also rebellious against a system that tells her that she is supposed to act and behave a certain way, and most heterosexual women are currently behaving as such. And when you look at what she does with those 3 points, she says that their options are either toppling the hierarchy completely, which action would be the destruction of the church, or packing up whatever shred of personal worth we've got left and leaving the church entirely, hopefully in a hell-raising burst of glory that in itself may educate other Christians. So, As a woman, as a lesbian, I invite you not to attempt reform of the church. I invite you either to destroy it or desert it. Personal integrity allows no other alternatives. How does she use a polarizing call to action? And knowing the audience of this speech, do you think it was fitting for her to call for such radical change?
It's obviously polarizing because she's talking to a group of pastors, which I would think would be primarily men, and so having a woman tell a bunch of men to destroy, desert the church would be very polarizing. I think maybe if you think there's some people that might be on the fence in that audience, it might be fitting to call for that radical change, but it was definitely good for the speech and as a historical impact, but at like just face value, speaking to who she's speaking to, it probably wasn't super fitting, but it fits with the theme of the speech, so.
Yeah. Anybody else want to? Yeah.
I think what you had said earlier with like it not having that middle ground, she gave, it was A or B. It wasn't like, maybe we could do this too. It was A or B, either destroy it or desert it. And I think whether it was fitting for her, I think that was absolutely fitting. I think that was something that, like in class how we talked about, a lot of times people feel like they have to falter to who they're speaking to and ask politely for rights. And I think that she clearly displayed that that's not an option anymore. And I think, I'm sure the audience didn't really like that, but I think it was very necessary for the type of change that she was trying to show to everyone, especially with her already being a woman. People might stop there and be like, I'm already not listening. And then her also being a lesbian, I think it was very fitting for her to make her voice known rather than try to fit into a space that already was kind of pushing her out.
Yeah. I think those kind of represent the two most talked about conclusions based on her call to action at the end. And hell yeah, were basically the way it went. Personally, obviously this is radical, but is that wrong? I love that actually. It may not have caused a room full of pastors to leave in a hell-raising burst of glory, ready to dismantle the structures and the theology that placed them at the top. But discomfort is really powerful, and we've talked about that. And without a doubt, at a pastor's conference, where most of them were probably preaching, this was disrupting of their day. And that was going to either keep them up at night, if nothing else. And that is extremely powerful. And so in the vein of effectiveness and what she was able to do, we kind of transitioned to the close of her impacts on a movement. Once she was out of the closet and in the media as a professor, lesbian, writer, and activist, Gearhart lived a very full life of influence, solidifying herself as a well-educated, woman-loving, and change-demanding woman. She connected a generation of women through feminism. When we look back at that time period, maybe it wasn't her alone, but women just like her, and the messages that they were creating were the very things that helped unite I know we discussed the idea of waves of feminism, but when we think of that structure, if we are going to apply that to this, the next wave of feminism is extremely more radical and extremely more united and extremely more power to the woman than we saw in the second wave. She also created a common vocabulary to inform our current understanding, working during a time when there wasn't really definitions and there wasn't really a common slang used. They were still establishing that. And that idea of establishing lesbianism as more than just sex-based is an understanding that we still have today, and something that we had to learn to understand an entire community as something more than just the sex that they're having. And finally, when we look to the church, Gearhart refused to be silent against the Christian opposition. Anita Bryant and her contemporaries were extremely loud and extremely adamant about their stances, but Gearhart was never quiet. And even when she kind of retreats back to women's land at a certain point. For a long time, she went back and forth between her life as a professor and activist to living in women's land, and it was really difficult for her because she couldn't just sit down. She was extremely vocal against the opposition that insisted on demonizing her. And again, who would disagree that the religious right is still very much running legislature? Not even the religious right would, because they're winning. This is a concept that we clearly still are fighting at. It's something that we're still seeing actively harming the gay community in laws today, very close to home. And we need more people disrupting and radical like Gearhart to put an end to it. And in the words of Gearhart, para mí, ese es el verdadero significado de la resurrección.
Well, I have a million. And not just for you, so don't feel like you're on the hot seat. I'm just throwing these out to the group as well. So, you know, there's lots of kinds of feminism. One is called separatist feminism. But certainly feminists aren't the only ones who wouldn't mind creating their own little utopia, right? You know, whether it's, you know, black only spaces or, you know, Hispanic speaking only spaces, you know, like, what are the pros and cons of separatism, do you think?
I would love to speak to
Okay.
Yeah.
No, actually, I was just gonna say, like, as a woman, sorry, sometimes men make life harder.
Some men make life harder, yes.
I'm speaking from a political science perspective.
Yeah.
Sometimes it makes life a lot harder. There was a city, I think it was Minnesota, in Minnesota, that for the first time had an all-woman city council, and that was all-woman city council. Maternal deaths went down.
Yeah.
Women's health care went up, and people were thriving. Women were thriving. Sorry, because men weren't there to like ruin the party. Like women thrive when women are in charge. And I think a space like that is so lovely, and I kind of want to go to women's land.
Yeah.
It sounds nice.
I'm not even devil's advocating that. I think that's 100% awesome. I think in the words of Gearhart though, because I think that that's sort of like who we're talking about. It's really interesting because as she gets older and in our different communications, we see her sort of change and evolve that very like, I'm a separatist stance. It's funny, if you look up Gearhart and you look up some of her quotes, she's all over a lot of women hating websites because of a certain quote, where she talks about the fact that if we kept, sounds extreme, it's fun though, if we kept the human population at 10% male and maintained it there, our society would thrive. And there's a direct quote, that's not the direct quote, but it is 10% male is the quote. And I don't even know, I couldn't find where she even said it. So I don't even know if it came out of her mouth, but the idea definitely came from her. And it is all over these websites still to this day. If you look up like lesbian separatism or like Meninist websites, she's on there for that quote. But it's funny because if we would play the rest of, and I'd be happy to, but if we played the rest of the clip in, it's featured in the documentary, but it comes from the Word Is Out interview where they ask her, are you a separatist? Her words are the clearest of it, and that comes in 78, where her earlier communications are coming from like 72, 74. You can already see a change start to happen, where she discusses the fact that like, she's a separatist, kind of. She believes in her heart of hearts that women would thrive and women would be better off, but she also says, how far can we take it? If I'm a separatist, am I separating women from men? Then am I also separating lesbians from heterosexual women? And then am I also separating this? And I'm also separating this? And she like goes down this line of examples. She's like, that's not practical. That's not realistic. That's not happening in practice, and it's also not good for people. So she was like, yeah, when you see her kind of sigh like that, I am, because I feel like it would be good for women, but it's not like something that we could exercise, or I think we should, basically.
Like at a practical level.
Yeah.
I mean, she's not saying anything different than Virginia Woolf said well before her, you know, a room of one's own, classic piece of English literature and, you know.
Yeah.
But it's hard to make political change from a utopia.
I feel like I think of, I guess this might sound more of a con, but I think in spaces where I think of women only, I also think of the type of women in the group and if they feel safe, depending on who's around them. Because sometimes I think it's the same concept as like the global sisterhood thing. It's like, yeah, like this is great, but like we're still not really at an equal level. So like even then, it's like for me, it's kind of difficult because I don't really think that even like if I think of like if I'm in a group of women, I think the first thing I pick out is how many other Black women are in the room, because that's the first thing that people see when they see me. And so I'm never just a woman. And so I think in that type of space, I would still have like concerns because I'm like, you know, and we see that in like the feminist movement where like, yeah, we're all women, but they didn't really view like lesbian women, trans women, Black women, like they were not a part of that. And I think when I was young, like I used to think like Susan B. Anthony, like for example, like they make her like in like history in our classes, like that she was this big like feminist and she loved women, but then she said that she would rather cut her arm off than let a Black person get the vote before her. And I used to think like before then that like she was like my hero. The betrayal when like I figured out that she doesn't even like my community. And so I think that was the concern. But then also, if I look at like spaces that are specific to being a Black woman, that I could possibly thrive in something like that. I think my entire friend group, they're all Black women, and I think I feel so liberated being around people like that. And I also, there's like groups on campus even, like here, like a group that I'm a part of that is specifically for women of color. And like, I think that is like my sort of utopia, if that makes sense. Because we talk about shared experiences and like different things that, I don't know, I think there's a different type of safety when it comes to that. And I don't want it to seem like it makes me like a separatist, like I don't want to be around like non-women of color, but I think that it's just a safety thing. Like I get concerned about stuff like that. Because that's a common thing that we see very often. And so I would hate to be put in a space like that if it was, you know, women who didn't support me as a human.
So what do we think about the fact it's so damn hard to find messages that Gearhart made? I mean, I hope you came to the conclusion she's a phenomenal woman. I mean, what a life. And thank you for making her come alive to us. You really, you know, it wasn't just an academic experience, right? You really made her, you personalized her well. You put a human face, you know, on her. That we can't, you would think it would be everywhere, right? I mean, even just on the internet. You can find speeches by like people you've never heard of, right? But not a serious leader in the movement. Like, you struggled, did you not?
Extremely.
Yeah.
It's also worth saying that that in the documentary trailer where you see her like fighting against John Briggs, we also look at like how far it goes when we like cut women from the movement. There's a documentary on Harvey Milk, and I haven't seen it myself, but I read the
There's a Hollywood movie called Milk.
And he in the documentary they take direct quotes from Gearhart's like debate and they just give them to Milk. They wrote them into his script and let him say them to look better against Briggs, which Milk was awesome. He said a fair share of his own great stuff, but they literally just wrote her out. Like she's not in that debate in the movie at all, but her quotes are. They're just given to the white guy in the movement.
It is insane how hard it is. Like
they wrote her out of that.
It would be
history.
everywhere. Yeah. Like in any the one that's in the book, our book, is like the only one that's really out there in the public domain.
And there's like a couple like complete transcripts.
Yeah. And this is a woman who gave hundreds and hundreds of speeches in her life.
In the documentary, in the trailer where she's clearly giving a speech on stage where she's talking about like, I wish they were here today. no idea where she gave that speech, what speech that is, when that happened, can't find it anywhere, but clearly she's giving it. Like, she's at rallies, she gave speech after speech during that time period, and like, they're nowhere.
Yeah, it's mind-numbingly frustrating.
I feel like I don't want to be this person because I feel like I talk about this all the time, but like I view two things when it comes to like the reason why it's so hard and why when it is you have to pay, and it's like partly erasure, and I think that's also something that I was dealing with my person too, because like that was something that was difficult to find, and if it was something I could find, you had to pay for it. And so it's like there's so much things I think are rooted in like capitalism also, which is also part of like a lot of feminist theories, because that is again systematically rooted, and like and the patriarchy has a huge part in how like, okay, well, if we can't get rid of it, you're gonna have to pay for it. And I think that that is something that I'm starting to see a lot more. And I'm just that person that will just be like, it's capitalism, like it's just the reason for literally everything. And so like when you said that you had to pay like, what was it, $11.99? That is literally ridiculous.
It was a 7-day free trial. I was like, well, I'm not getting the whole project done in 7 days, so I guess I'm signing up and then I'm paying $11.
And I feel like there's like a lobbying trip for a political science course that I'm taking, and like the movie that we were watching for what we're lobbying about, we couldn't find it. It's like on DVD or you have to pay for it. And I'm like, that's so interesting. And it's about like Native Americans and like boarding school and like trying to get that act passed to like look into like all the trauma they faced. And like the movie that represents that is like you have to pay for it. And we're like, why? You would think that like they would want that to be more accessible. And I think that whenever you have to pay for something, I'm immediately just gonna chop it up to capitalism every single time. And
even the books of hers that I was able to get weren't in our library. Like they were here at a smaller school. I had to go through Ohio Link, and they were like Cincinnati, Case Western, etc. And I had to like wait a week to get my book in, and I'm like, sorry, Dr. Kuza, I need another week because I still haven't got my artifact. So
yeah, I mean it's just like
I'm gonna be like, can I buy the book?
Yeah, it's just amazing. Someone this important in the life of the movement, and you can barely find her words, right? I mean, I just wanted to emphasize that. So you have lived with Gearhart now. What impact, this one is just for you, has she made an impact on your life in any way? And if that's too personal, you can say, I'll take a pass.
I mean, definitely yes, but I don't know, I just got super like, sometimes when I'm really into the research, I'm rabbit holing really hard, and so this was definitely one of those examples where I was just like, oh my god, like everything I found out, and I would like find another piece of her, like womanization of rhetoric. I could not read the whole thing, and I don't have time for that, but it's super interesting that she's just, it's an entire like study of like rhetoric, and like she's like, actually that's violent, and she's like, women should just communicate with each other. That's so crazy. That was in 1979, and we don't do anything with that.
I will say, it was assigned to me as a very young graduate student, so it is well read in the field.
Yeah, and I don't know, I just like also as like being a really cool lesbian. Like I didn't even know that was like a person that existed, and then I'm like reading all about women's land, and I'm reading about all this stuff, and I'm like, I want to read the Wonderground, and I want to read this, and I don't know, I guess, I don't know, like just seeing it is really cool, and just having like, knowing so much about her as a human now is like, really interesting, and like I don't know, I was like telling my other like lesbian friends about her, and I was like, you gotta look this lady up.
This is where we should go for spring break.
Yeah, well, and then like my friend that goes to Case was like, oh my god, really? And like went to their library. She's like, we have the book right here. And I was like, oh, screw you. I gotta wait a week for it still. And she was like, this is so fascinating. I was like, I know, right? And so like it was fun to just like tell other people to like, and I was like presenting this at home to my partner like to practice, and they were like, that's so cool, and I was like, I know. She's just a really cool person, and like watching that trailer, I like kept saying to you, like I want to meet her. I just wish she wouldn't have died 3 years ago, because I wanted to like go meet her. She would have been such an interesting person to talk to. She looks effing hilarious. I found so many interviews. They were shorter, but a lot of interviews on like free on YouTube. Deborah Craig like recorded some of her interviews and uploaded them, and she's just funny. Like she's just like a funny person.
Well, and just the fact that, you know, they're doing all this fundraising just to make this documentary, you know, like,
Yeah.
goes to
Yeah.
this question I just asked about, well, why is it so hard to find anything on her? You know, just that they're doing pieces of, you know, like it's been like a decade that they've been trying to piece together, you know, the money to do this. So let me, last question, this is again for the group. What do you think of her claim that rhetoric is a kind of violence? This is her main argument in the womanization of rhetoric.
I mean, yeah, words are really hurtful. Yeah, the sticks and stones, whatever. Yeah, bullcrap.
Yeah.
Words hurt. People are really good at making words that hurt other people. So yeah, it's violent. I don't have to be bleeding to be injured.
Right.
She also talks about, like, in that essay, the idea that, like, when you're in a debate setting and you're using rhetorical strategies that are proven to work, you're not listening to anything someone's saying. And we know that in, like, basic, like, psychology of communicating with a romantic partner. Like, you're not listening, so you're just defending, or you're just trying to prove a point and getting them to be on your side and all those things. So she talks about, like, being a good listener and communicating your perspective for the purpose of, like, a roundtable discussion type of feel versus like a bark setting, you know?
Yeah, I mean, traditional rhetoric, the idea that there's a speaker and they're trying to persuade you, they're trying to change you in some way, that's the kind of, like, it implies there's something wrong with you to begin with that needs to be changed, right? You don't have the right attitude, or you're not doing the right behavior, or whatever, you know, so it's an interesting thing. And yet, how else are we gonna change? Like, how do you be an activist without rhetoric? You can't, right? So,
I feel like the intention behind rhetoric is like what determines whether it can be violent or not. Like how, like the round table compared to like speaking at someone and telling them how it needs to change or they need to change or something. I think there is so much more intention when you genuinely have like conversation in a way that's like to get to the point of us like agreeing. But also, like, there's only so much that conversation can do. And I think we see that with several movements that have gone on and still go on today, where, like, we can say, oh, this is terrible, but then you can, you know, shut your phone down and then act like it never happened. And so, I feel like that happens pretty often where we recognize, oh, this is terrible, and, like, we should fix this, and, like, oh, this is something else. But then there's not really any follow-up with that. And so I think that is how I view it as violent, because it's like, how can you recognize that something is like the conditions that some people have to go through in like in our country or in this wherever is like not a good thing and it should change, but then you're able to kind of like turn a blind eye to it, because like if we're just talking, once we stop talking, nothing's happening. And so then at that point it's like, well then what are you actually doing? And you know, I think that's something that people should consider also.
Well, we only have a minute or two left, so I want to invite you to reflect on what did Ray do well that the rest of you might be smart to imitate in your own presentations. As a speaker, like we're focusing on her as a speaker. What were things they did well?
For many.
Yeah.
I think you just encapsulated me. I was like, wow, like this is a lot. But it's like also like I felt what you were feeling about her, and I think I had never heard of who this was before now, and I feel like this has just genuinely intrigued me to like actually get to know who this is. And like I think you brought a lot of that flair to who she is to us, and not just like this is like it's easy to just kind of sit up and talk and just like, okay, this is my presentation because I have to do it and blah blah blah, but it's like you didn't make it that. And I feel like that's really important when it comes to visibility for people within this community that fought for LGBTQ rights.
Very engaging, whether it was the delivery, Q&A, or the videos, or the discussion questions, right? Very, very engaging. I also thought the pacing was great, right? You left time for discussion, but you covered everything you needed to, you know, everything I spelled out had to be covered. You spent just the right amount of time on each of those things, made it super easy to follow along. There was an amazing level of detail, right? And I loved how you, and I know you had to dig for these sources, but you didn't just rely on those sources. You brought to the table your own thinking, right? Your own synthesis. You know, you talked about the common themes across the messages. That's not written anywhere. You came up with that, right? So I like the fact that she wasn't just regurgitating what she read. You could tell she thought deeply about this and, you know, and took it to another level by sharing those thoughts with us, right? Her own analysis. So I thought that was, you know, super important. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on. I have like little dots about things I wanted to highlight that did well, but there's too many and we're out of time. I am gonna say though that Ray's gonna present at least part of this for Scholars Day. Yeah, because the whole time you were talking like, damn, this is really good. I was like, I don't know what to tell her to cut out to meet the time limit she's gonna have on Scholar Day, because you won't have the whole